liberalism, when it applies to foreign policy, has this universalist dimension that is of great importance. And what it means in terms of a broad foreign policy goal is that you quickly become consumed with spreading liberal democracy across the globe. That emphasis on inalienable rights, which leads to universalism, produces a foreign policy that emphasizes the spreading of liberal democracy. And there are three reasons for that. This really gets to the heart and soul of the argument. You want to spread democracy for three reasons. One, to protect human rights across the world. Two, to cause international peace. And three, to protect liberalism at home. And again, all of this grows out of the emphasis on individualism and inalienable rights. The basic argument is that people who live in a far-off country are no different than people who live in your country. Borders actually don't matter very much. Rights are of great importance, and everybody has rights. And when the rights of non-Americans are being threatened, Americans have a responsibility to do everything they can to protect those people whose rights are being violated. And of course, the most important right here is the right to life. If some foreign dictator is murdering large numbers of his or her people, the United States has a responsibility that grows out of this universalism to protect the rights of those individuals that are being violated. What happens here is that you go from a situation where you can use your military forces to intervene in different countries when there are gross violations of individual rights and fix the problem and then leave. You go from that more modest policy to one where you decide that the best way to protect rights is simply to turn another country into a liberal democracy. Because once it's a liberal democracy, the individual rights, which are privileged in liberalism, are protected by definition. So if you have a planet that is filled with nothing but liberal democracies, the problem of gross violations of human rights is simply taken off the table. If you merely just act like a fire department and you only intervene in those situations where you see rights being violated, you fix it, and then you get out, you don't ultimately solve the problem. Second reason to spread liberal democracy, it leads to international peace. Democratic peace theory is based on the basic liberal template involving rights and tolerance, right? It's the whole idea that people across the planet have a set of inalienable rights and that they tend to respect the rights of other individuals. And that leads to international peace if you can spread democracy across the planet. In other words, if you create a world of all democracies, they're not going to fight against each other because people respect the rights of people in other countries and they're tolerant. The tolerance grows out of that emphasis on inalienable rights. Oh, by the way, this is exactly what happened in Europe, according to the liberal story. Why do we have peace in Europe? Because it's filled with liberal democracies. And I'll talk more about this in the context of NATO expansion. They don't fight each other. You don't get terrorism. You don't get nuclear proliferation. When do states pursue liberal hegemony? This is the second big question. My argument is it depends largely on the structure of the system. It depends largely on whether or not the system is bipolar, multipolar, or unipolar. If it's bipolar or multipolar, In other words, if there are two or more great powers in the system, states cannot pursue liberal hegemony. They have to act according to balance of power logic. When there are two or more great powers, each of those great powers has to worry about the other great power, and therefore has to worry about the balance of power, and has to act according to balance of power logic. In a unipolar system, where there is a single great power, this is the United States, of course, when the Cold War ends, you can pursue liberal hegemony because you don't have to worry about the balance of power, because there is effectively no balance of power. You are Godzilla, and you are free to do pretty much what you want. And you understand what's happening here. If you're Godzilla and you have this liberal impulse hardwired into you, you know what you're going to do. You're going to try and create democracy all over the world. I'll say more about that in a second. Bruno Montero, as you know, has written the seminal book on unipolarity, and he says in that book that the unipole has three options. If you think about it, these make perfect sense. First of all, the unipole can go home because it's so powerful and secure that it doesn't have to sweat what's going on in the rest of the world. You just go home. You won. We won the Cold War. We're Godzilla. Let's go home. Who's going to threaten us? And if the minions want to fight among themselves, who cares? That's one possibility. Second is you can stay involved abroad and use the power you have to maintain the status quo. Or number three, you can stay involved abroad and use that power to do social engineering on a grand scale. That is what Uncle Sam did, because Uncle Sam has this liberal impulse hardwired into it. And it, of course, has the capability in terms of raw power. And as I pointed out to you last time, social engineering is at the heart of modern liberalism. Modern liberalism is all about social engineering. And modern liberals have great confidence in social engineering. So when you put the distribution of power, this liberal DNA, which involves this universalist impulse and your belief in social engineering, you're off to the races. And that's exactly what happened after 1989. The three-part solution or formula for preventing conflict is, number one, inalienable rights. If everybody has rights and everybody has the right to life, not going to be a lot of killing if you can convince people of that. Furthermore, there's going to be a lot of tolerance. So purveying the norm of tolerance is very important in the liberal story. But all liberals understand that emphasizing rights and emphasizing tolerance, those two things together, is not enough. You need a night watchman state. Think about the state of nature. Liberals start in the state of nature where individuals are constantly in a situation where there's potential for conflict and death. And what they do is they form a social contract. And the social contract involves a higher authority. So you need that higher authority. There's no higher authority in international politics. There is no world state. There's no social contract, despite all this talk about community. Therefore, if you're surrounded by other great powers, you have no choice but to compete with them, according to liberal logic. When there are other great powers in the system, you have to compete with them, and you can't pursue liberal hegemony. But if you're in unipolarity, the imbalance is so great between Godzilla and all of the minions that Godzilla is free to pursue liberal hegemony. Third reason to spread liberal democracy is to protect liberalism at home. The fact is that virtually every liberal theorist understands that you're not going to convince every single person in a liberal society that liberalism is the ideal political system. And there's always a danger on the home front that there'll be a group that is powerful and will attempt to overthrow the liberal order. And what really scares liberals is the thought that that group on the home front will form an alliance with a foreign country. And that foreign country will help fuel revolution at home. Okay? So if you live in a world of all liberal democracies, that problem is taken off the table. That's reflected in Woodrow Wilson's famous words. He went before Congress on April 2nd, 1917, to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. And that's where he made his famous remarks that his aim was to help create a world that could be made safe for democracy. To give you two other examples of this. The United States and the Red Scares after both World War I and during the early Cold War. What was the basic fear here? The basic fear was that there were communists in the United States, and those communists would ally with a communist state like the Soviet Union, and the end result of that would be trouble, if not revolution, on the home front. So if you can create a situation where you turn the Soviet Union into a liberal democracy, you turn communist China into a liberal democracy, you just take that problem right off the table. And think about the problem today from China and Russia's point of view. What China and Russia today fear is that liberal groups and individuals inside those countries who are unhappy with the likes of Vladimir Putin will ally with the United States to undermine the regime. You go to Moscow today, you go to Beijing today, they are really worried about regime change. As hard as that may be to believe, regime change instigated by the United States in an alliance with liberal forces inside their own countries. Why is liberal hegemony doomed? Reason number one, social engineering in foreign countries is an extremely difficult enterprise under the best of circumstances. Indeed, social engineering in one's own country is especially difficult. But the idea that we can go into a foreign country, where most of the people don't speak the language, don't understand the culture, knock off the regime, right, and therefore create a lot of chaos, and then create order out of that chaos, and not just order out of that chaos, but create liberal democracy or even just democracy. This is a pipe dream. And using the US military for that, right? But you start talking about taking the American military, putting it in a place like Vietnam, putting it in a place like Afghanistan, and letting it do social engineering, not going to work. Second is, nationalism is a remarkably powerful force, and it causes the target state to resist foreign intervention. Self-determination and sovereignty are at the heart of nationalism. Right? The people in a nation state, the nation itself and the leaders who run a state, they want to determine for themselves what their domestic politics look like, and they want to determine for themselves what their foreign policy looks like. This is what sovereignty is all about. And they don't want a foreign country, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union going into Afghanistan, or Britain going into Afghanistan, or France going into Vietnam. These people don't want foreigners running their politics. They don't want foreigners occupying their country. And who can blame them? As I point out here, think about the US outrage over claims that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election. Apparently, from reading the newspapers, this drives Americans crazy. The idea that the Russians interfered in our elections. Well, we interfere in elections all over the planet. We interfere in the politics of states all over the planet. We think we have a God-given right to go into any country, violate sovereignty, if it's done for just purposes, which means promoting liberal democracy. We have a rich history of it, as you know. Reason number three, individual rights, this whole concept of inalienable rights, are oversold. If you look around the world at surveys and you look at a number of historical cases, what you see is that people generally think rights are important, but they don't privilege them to the extent that the theory says they should. And people will often sacrifice rights for stability. There's a lot of survey data that shows that this is true today in the Middle East. Hardly surprising. If you lived in one of those countries that the United States has helped wreck, would you be interested first and foremost in creating liberal democracy, or would you be interested first and foremost in creating some stability? I think the answer is quite clear. But what this means is that liberal democracy is not always an easy sell. It's not like you're going abroad and everybody's out there just demanding liberal democracy. Oh my God, this is the most important political system in the world, and if we can just get it, we'll live happily ever after. This is not to say that there aren't many places where they would prefer liberal democracy over some semi-authoritarian system. There are cases like that. But the point is, it's not an easy sell. And then finally, some states actually act to balance against the unipole. They act according to realist logic. This certainly has been true with China and Russia, and also with Iran and North Korea. I'm going to talk a little bit more about NATO expansion in a second. The Russians view NATO expansion from a purely realpolitik point of view. Right? This is balanced power politics. The idea that the United States can take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union and march it up to Russia's doorstep and make Ukraine and Georgia part of the West is not going to happen. They'll tell you that. It is not going to happen for balance of power reasons. Let's talk a little bit about NATO expansion. As you know, when the Cold War ended, shortly thereafter, in the Clinton administration, they began to talk about expanding NATO. And as I'll make clear as we go along here, this is one of the principal causes of the conflict with Russia over Ukraine. The first expansion was in 1999. We brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. The second expansion was in 2004. We brought in the Baltic states, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia, so forth and so on. And then after 2008, we were talking about bringing in Ukraine and Georgia. Now, when things blew up after the February 22nd, 2014 coup in Ukraine, when things blew up between us and the Russians, they took Crimea, so forth and so on, everybody said the Russians are a threat to overrun Eastern Europe. The whole purpose of NATO expansion was to contain Russia, and thank goodness we were actually moving further and further into Eastern Europe. That's simply not true. That's simply not true. There's no evidence to support that argument. We were moving NATO eastward in large part as an element in a liberal strategy that was designed to take this security community, in the Deutschian sense of the term, that we had created in Western Europe during the Cold War and move it eastward. It included not only spreading NATO, it included spreading the European Union and promoting democracy. You all remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and you remember the Rose Revolution in Georgia? This was all designed to take this security community and move it eastward. Michael McFaul, who I've debated on this issue of the Ukraine crisis, who was the US ambassador to Russia from 2012 to right before the 2014 coup, says that I told Putin on numerous occasions, and I told his lieutenants on numerous occasions, that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia. And he genuinely believed that. Barack Obama has said the same thing. He genuinely believed it. These people who were pushing NATO expansion did not believe in realpolitik and containment. In fact, they said that anyone who believes in realpolitik and containment, and that includes yours truly, is a 17th century person. That's right. We're dinosaurs. That world has gone away with the end of the Cold War. So NATO expansion was not motivated by realist logic. And by the way, virtually all the realists were opposed to NATO expansion and said, this is not going to have a happy ending. And George Kennan gave a famous interview to Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who wrote it up. And Kennan said exactly that. This is unnecessary and it's going to lead to big trouble. And surprise of surprises, it led to a war in August 2008 between Russia and Georgia. And in 2014, you ended up with a war between Russia and Ukraine over Ukraine. Right? But it was not driven by realist logic. Talk a little bit about the Ukraine crisis. As I said to you before, NATO expansion, EU expansion, and spreading democracy were all about enlarging the security community that existed in Western Europe. And there was even thoughts of eventually bringing the Russians in. It was not balance of power politics. But what happened is that after the April 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, where we said that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO, you had shortly thereafter, in August 2008, a war over Georgia, and then in 2014, you had the war over Ukraine. Remember, 2008, April 2008, look at the communique that was issued after the Bucharest NATO summit. It said that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. And you had wars involving both of those countries. And the Russians have no intention of letting either Georgia or Ukraine become part of the West. They'll wreck both those countries before they let it happen. This is basic geopolitics. And what's happened to Putin? Putin's standing has gone up significantly. Why? Basic nationalism. Nationalism at home. Factors driving the Russian behavior. Realism 101, nationalism, and stability over rights. That's the Russian story. That's why it's so hard to sell liberal democracy in Russia, the last consideration, and why the Ukraine crisis happened, first point. And second point about nationalism is why Putin is so popular. Talk a little bit about the Bush doctrine. There are 5 countries that were the main targets of regime change. We actually used military force in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. In the case of Syria, we provided huge amounts of money and training to the rebels. We were deeply committed to overthrowing the government in Damascus, the Assad government. If you read the newspapers in the United States, what you see is people constantly beating Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton over the head for not doing anything to get rid of the regime in Damascus. This is simply wrong. We did not intervene with our own military forces in any meaningful way, but we were behind. We were behind the insurgency in a major way. We were deeply committed to regime change in Syria. And we were also involved in regime change in Egypt. We helped get rid of Mubarak, and then when the Muslim Brotherhood won a democratic election, we helped usher that leader, Mohamed Morsi, out of power when the Egyptian people and the United States became disenchanted with Morsi. But if you just sort of look at those 5 cases, Afghanistan is a disaster zone, Iraq, another disaster zone, Libya, another disaster zone, Syria, another disaster zone. And although we had a brief interregnum where we had liberal democracy or democracy in Egypt, that lasted about a year. And now we're back to where we have a thug in power who we're comfortable supporting, right? This is an abysmal track record. Just think of all the death and destruction in the Middle East since 2001. It's really stunning. Why did it fail? Difficulty of doing social engineering, nationalism, and the fact that most people, certainly at this point in time, privilege stability over rights. My basic argument is that liberal hegemony is doomed because social engineering is wickedly difficult, nationalism causes significant resistance, individual rights matter, but not that much, and realism remains a key factor for some states. I think that liberal hegemony undermines liberalism at home. It threatens core American values. because America becomes a militarized state. You get this huge national security state. And especially when you're fighting a global war on terror and you think you definitely have to monitor what people in the society are doing. You have to turn the National Security Agency loose to monitor people's emails and telephone conversations and so forth and so on. Right? So I think that as founding fathers understood, James Madison in particular, no nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And we live in a country that's engaged in continual warfare. And it's engaged in continual warfare because we have decided to pursue a policy of liberal hegemony. And that was not necessary. As Nuno said, when you're in unipolarity, you have three choices, three very different choices, three stark choices. And we decided to do massive social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel. We tried to create a planet that's filled with liberal democracies. And it failed. And that's where we are today. Liberalism as an ideology, right, provides a very powerful impetus for pursuing liberal hegemonies. Inside of liberalism, there is an important strand that would push a great power to pursue a policy of restraint, not a policy of liberal hegemony. And then answer the question of why that strand of liberalism seems to lose out to the more expansive strand. Then I want to talk about restraint, what exactly it is, talk about realism in restraint, because I'll make the argument that restraint is basically a realist foreign policy. Then I want to talk about nationalism in restraint. And as you remember from that first talk, I said that what I was really interested in doing in this book was talking about the relationship between liberalism, nationalism, and realism. So here you see the realism and nationalism coming into play to challenge the liberal hegemony. Liberalism is based on the assumption that individuals cannot reach agreement on universal truth. There are always going to be disputes. So it's impossible to agree on first principles, and therefore it's imperative to adopt a live and let live political order. This is why liberalism privileges liberty and tolerance. This is what I love about living in liberal America. Right? There's a great emphasis placed on giving people a lot of space to lead their lives the way they want to. And we emphasize things like tolerance and peaceful conflict resolution. These are wonderful values. And then I say, shouldn't this basic logic apply to relations among states, just as it applies to relations among individuals? Shouldn't we, as liberal America, tolerate the fact that China has no interest in being a liberal state and prefers to be an authoritarian state? Or if someone wants to create a fascist state, why should we care? According to liberalism, you're not supposed to be able to say that liberalism is better than fascism or authoritarianism or communism. Take your choice. According to liberalism, right, people can't agree on first principles, and therefore you want to give people plenty of room to live their life the way they see fit. Well, why doesn't the same argument apply to states? Why aren't we more tolerant? Again, if you go back to the universalist strand, there's no tolerance there. But again, there's a particularist strand as well as a universalist strand. But what's clear is that the universalist strand wins out. And the question is, why is that the case? And I'm not 100% sure, but it's probably because liberals tend to believe that they have discovered at least one important truth. They're basically violating their core precept that you can't reach agreement on first principles. Liberals are basically saying that liberal democracy is the best political order and there is no acceptable alternative. But you're not supposed to be able to say that. If you follow the precepts of realism, you'll have a less warlike world than you will following the precepts of liberal hegemony. And why is that the case? 3 reasons. Here's the first. First, realists are only willing to fight in limited areas of the world. Liberal hegemonists want to fight everywhere because they're interested in spreading liberal democracy all over the planet. There is no area of the world that is unimportant from a strategic point of view for a liberal hegemonist. They don't prioritize. There are no priorities. For a realist, that's not true at all. During the Cold War, the United States was interested in competing with the Soviets all over the planet. Realists said this is ridiculous. There are only 3 areas of the world that matter for the United States: Europe, in those days we used to say Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Those are the 3 areas you fight and die. The rest of the Middle East? No. Africa? No. Central Asia? No. Southeast Asia? No. It's no accident that every realist except Henry Kissinger was opposed to the Vietnam War. It's a strategically unimportant area. You only fight in areas where there are great powers, or in the case of the Gulf, a critical resource, oil. Policy of restraint basically calls for getting out of the business of spreading democracy or promoting democracy around the globe, and especially at the end of a rifle barrel. My view is if you want to spread democracy around the world, the best way to do it is to be the city on the hill, right? Have a model democracy at home, and then you can expound to other people what you think the virtues are of liberal democracy, and then leave it up to them to decide what to do. But you don't want to purposely try to spread it with aggressive policies. That's what restraint is basically all about. Okay, realism and restraint. The essence of realism. Realism focuses on great powers, not minor powers. For realists, the states that really matter are the great powers in the system. And the only time that minor powers really matter is when those minor powers are adjacent to great powers. The 3 countries that have the worst geographical location in the world are Korea and Poland. And now I think you could probably throw in Ukraine, right? These are countries that really are in the wrong location, right? And they're minor powers, they matter. But by and large, realism is a theory that focuses on the great powers, and it focuses on the balance of power, right? The argument that realists make is that those great powers care greatly about how much power they have relative to the other great powers in the system. Realists, as you know, pay little attention to domestic politics. Realists basically treat states as black boxes. It doesn't matter to most realists whether a state is a democracy or an authoritarian state. The structure of the international system in the realist story basically forces most states to behave in similar ways. With realists, you get priorities, respect for balancing behavior, and respect for the fact that war is an enterprise that is very hard to predict. Now, let me turn to nationalism and restraint. Remember, I have a double-barreled shotgun here, realism and nationalism. Key point you want to keep in mind about nationalism, it makes conquest very hard. First of all, because conquest is hard, that means the United States should be very wary about trying to conquer other states. Right? And second, you want to remember that the ability of your adversary to conquer other states is also greatly limited by nationalism. So what I'm saying here is if you understand nationalism, you understand the power of nationalism, it's going to make you very cautious about going on a rampage or trying to conquer other countries. And it's going to make you less worried when your adversary starts to try to conquer other countries. So what I'm saying to you is that both nationalism and realism push the United States toward restraint. Restraint, on the other hand, is anathema to advocates of liberal hegemony. So let's talk a little bit about the domino theory. The domino theory goes like this. It says that communism is, like liberalism, is a universal ideology. And what happens is that if the Soviet Union succeeds in Vietnam, then Thailand will fall, Indonesia will fall, Singapore will fall, Japan will fall, Korea will fall, eventually the dominoes will fall in Europe, and eventually the big domino, the United States, will fall. Right? And again, it's based on the notion that one, conquest is easy, and two, when you conquer those other countries, what will happen is that other countries will just bandwagon because, first of all, they'll find communism very attractive. They'll find communism very attractive for ideological reasons. But secondly, they'll understand that they're going to be conquered next. Just to take this out of context, the domino theory and how it applies to the Bush Doctrine. Remember I said yesterday, the Bush Doctrine called for knocking off regimes in the Middle East and replacing them with liberal democracies. And the first place on the train line was Iraq. But Iraq was not the last place. We're then going to do Syria, do Iran. When the Israelis caught wind in January 2002, we wrap up the war in Afghanistan, or at least so we think, in December 2001. And then in early 2002, we're getting the shotgun loaded to go into Iraq. The Israelis catch wind of that. They send a high-level delegation to Washington, and they say, are you crazy? Iraq is not the principal threat in the region. Iran is. And the Israelis want us to do Iran. The administration and the neocons on the outside say, relax, we're going to do Iran after we do Iraq, or if we do Syria after we do Iraq, by the time we roll up Iraq and then roll up Syria, the Iranians will throw up their hands and jump on the bandwagon. Right? That's the domino theory. And again, it's not surprising at all, because you see a very powerful military actor, the United States, that can conquer states easily and that has this political ideology, liberalism, that it believes in. So it's domino theory logic. But back to the Cold War, we were worried stiff that the Soviet Union would conquer this country, conquer that country, and do it very easily. And then this transnational ideology called communism would help facilitate the fall of all the dominoes, including the United States at the end of the story. Okay? So how does this affect U.S. behavior? We fight in Vietnam. Right? Read Fred Logevall's terrific book on Vietnam called Choosing War, which is the best book I've read on why we went into Vietnam. One of the principal reasons we went into Vietnam is almost everybody in a position of power at that point in time, including huge chunks of people in the public, believed in the domino theory. They believed that we had to stop them in Vietnam because if we didn't, dominoes would fall. Right? What's the fate of the domino theory? The domino theory. It's a joke, right? Any good realist understands that the domino theory is a joke. First of all, conquest is really difficult. You know what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. You know what's happened to us in Afghanistan. You know what happened to the British in Iraq. You know what's happened to us in Iraq. You know what happened to the French, the Americans, and the Chinese in Vietnam. Nationalism is a real obstacle to conquest. So the idea that you can have easy conquest throughout Southeast Asia, which was what we were thinking about in the 64-65 period, not going to happen. And then with regard to the ideology, this transnational ideology, communism is no match for nationalism. You run nationalism up against communism, nationalism will win every time. Have you noticed where the Soviet Union's gone? Right? It's broken up into its series of constituent nation states. Remember the Sino-Soviet split? Oh, by the way, China, communist state, invaded North Vietnam, communist state. Oh, by the way, why did they do that? Because Vietnam, communist state, invaded Cambodia, communist state. Doesn't sound like that transnational ideology had all that much appeal, right? Nationalism, very powerful force. And of course, when we first went to war in Vietnam, I'm old enough to remember this. I was young at the time, but the argument was that the reason the North Vietnamese were so fearsome, and they were fearsome, right? Nobody went into combat against the North Vietnamese had any doubts about that. These were tough hombres. The reason they were so fearsome, so they said, was because they were communists. But with the passage of time, we came to understand that that was fundamentally flawed line of argument. They were so tough because of nationalism, and that's what made conquest so hard. So, my point to you, if you had to do the Cold War all over again, this is how I'd do it. I'd be relaxed. I wouldn't worry about the spread of communism. Hardly at all. And I certainly would never invade a country like Vietnam. I'd stay out. Because the domino theory doesn't work. And I would argue that if we become engaged in an intense security competition with a rising China, which I think is likely to happen if China rises, I think the last thing we want to do is start invading countries for fear of a domino theory-like effect as a result of Chinese aggression. And if anything, if the Chinese get into the business of invading countries that they think they can conquer and facilitate some kind of domino effect on their part, not going to work. With the first great foreign policy debate in the United States regarding whether or not we should go abroad and intervene in the politics of other states in a big way, or we should basically pursue a policy of restraint. And it's a debate that takes place after the Spanish-American War in 1898. It's a huge debate, and Kinzer lays it out in great detail. And of course, the restrainers lose. But Kinzer makes the point that if you look at the history of debates about American foreign policy over the course of the 20th century, you see that the restrainers are there in force at almost every key decision point. And actually, in the 1930s, when the United States was an isolationist country, the restrainers were in the driver's seat. I don't think that was a good thing, by the way. I think isolationism was not in America's national interest. And I think it's fortunate that we got into the war. But the only point I'm trying to make to you here is that restrainers, in the form of isolationists, were very powerful at that point in time. And after World War II, there was a huge debate between restrainers, isolationists again, and people who wanted to use American military force broadly. Moreover, I do think that there's actually little public support for liberal hegemony. It's basically an elite-driven enterprise. You want to remember that George W. Bush got elected in 2000 running against nation building and arguing that what we have to do is pull in our horns and not try to reshape the globe. George W. Bush, as a presidential candidate, was very critical of the Clinton administration for being far too ambitious on the foreign stage. And he was elected, and then he became the most ambitious foreign policy president in our history. He was a liberal hegemonist par excellence. Read his second inauguration address. Read a number of the speeches that he gave at places like AEI. George W. Bush sounds just like Woodrow Wilson. There's no better spokesperson for liberal hegemony than George W. Bush. That may be hard to believe, but I'm not exaggerating. It's really quite remarkable. But anyway, he ran as a candidate calling for restraint. Go back and read Condoleezza Rice's famous piece in the January-February 2000 issue of Foreign Affairs, where she, who was very close to George W. Bush, laid out his foreign policy. It's all there. And then you remember Barack Obama. Barack Obama got elected on the platform that he was going to pursue restraint. And he, of course, failed. And he basically admitted he failed in his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic in his last year in office. But he was interested as a candidate in restraint, and he got elected, and George W. Bush got elected. And as you heard me say yesterday, Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony really hard. He challenged almost every element of the strategy, and he got elected. So the public has no problem electing leaders who are opposed to liberal hegemony and are in favor of restraint. But the problem is once those leaders are in office, they seem to go in the other direction. The majority in the foreign policy establishment, the blob, is deeply attached to liberal hegemony. And they'll do everything they can to stymie restraint. My good friend Steve Walt has recently finished a book manuscript that deals with the blob and its love of liberal hegemony. And he makes a somewhat different argument than I do, but it reinforces the point that the blob has a deep-seated interest in combating restraint and continuing to pursue liberal hegemony. Steve's argument is that it's basically a jobs program for the liberal elite. Right, that all these people in Washington have jobs that depend on having the United States run the world, so that they can occupy very important positions in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the National Security Council. And if you begin to shrink all those institutions, right, and you don't have military bases all over the world, and you're not interfering in the politics of every country on the planet, right, people are going to start losing jobs. If China continues to rise, Russia's resurrection from the dead continues, it's the end of liberal hegemony. It's just over. This is the point that I have made on a number of occasions. You cannot have liberal hegemony in bipolarity or multipolarity. You can only have it in unipolarity. Because if you're in a bipolar system, or you're in a multipolar system where the United States is one of the poles, the United States has to pay attention to the other great power or powers, and it has to engage in balance of power politics. It cannot afford to pursue a liberal foreign policy in any significant way, maybe somewhat on the margins, but the essence of a great power's foreign policy in a bipolar or multipolar world is almost always going to be realism.